Hello, my name is Art Friedman, and welcome to today's panel. The panel is scheduled for approximately 60 minutes. Our panel will address digital identity and privacy challenges and is entitled, "Is Technology Giving Democracies the Digital Rope to Hang Ourselves?" Digital identity and privacy challenges are at the top of the list of international cyber issues threatening our society and national security and national prosperity. Our panel will address thought-provoking topics to include the need for a national comprehensive strategy and policy addressing the collection and use of personal data by both private and public sectors. Before I introduce the panel, I wanted to let you know employee detailed to DISA to support their identity, credential, and access management mission. I also co-chair a working group for the Committee for National Security Systems, developing national policy addressing digital identity, and a member of the ASEA Cyber Committee. All of our panelists have impressive careers. Joseph Brendler served over 31 years in the U.S. Army and retired as a Major General, following his final assignment in which he served as the Chief of Staff of the United States Cyber Command. He then started Brendler Consulting, LLC, through which he continues to provide strategic advisory service to his clients. He is a true thought leader, and I'd like to thank Joe for his inspiration for the title of this panel, which occurred when he commented several months ago on a quote from Vladimir Lenin that capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. Mark Grohmann, a principal for the Grohmann Consulting Group, a lawyer and national privacy expert, served as the senior privacy advisor for the Obama administration and currently serves on the privacy advisory panel for the National Security Agency and the Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board for NIST. Greg Twohill, retired from the U.S. Air Force as a brigadier general, is currently the president of Appgate. Previously, he was elected by President Obama as the U.S. government's first chief information security officer, and he also served as DHS's Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director of the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. Additionally, Greg and I co-chair the Digital Identity and Privacy Subcommittee for ASEA's Cyber Committee. It's a real honor to be moderating this panel with such a distinguished group, accomplished group. I have several questions I'd like to ask our panel members. I started reading Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. A section in the book addresses Google, the pioneer of surveillance capitalism. One of her quotes is, "Google is to surveillance capitalism what the Ford Motor Company and General Motors were to mass-based, production-based managerial capitalism." And my question is, do you agree with the author's comparison with respect to this new form of capitalism? And do you see technology companies with advanced search engines impacting our privacy and potentially changing how government and industry operates? I'd like to start with Mark, and if you could have a focus on privacy to answer the question.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished colleagues who I've worked with before. So, the book about surveillance capitalism raises some really critically important points. And at a broad brush, I think that the arguments are valid, although I might have some issues with details. So let me break it down this way. Where we are today in 2020 is that industry, much of it, and I'm proud to say American industry, is using and profiting from and leveraging data in a way we never have before. And in many respects, that's a great thing. But the problem is, and the challenges we're facing, is that this use of data is not transparent, it's not known, and consumers and policymakers, frankly, don't understand the scope and the reach. And so let me give you some examples about the kinds of issues I work on and what concerns me. First of all, most of the data today we're talking about is not provided by a person, an individual, directly to a company, the way we used to think about it when you would sign up at a website or maybe fill out a survey. We live in a society where the data is observed through cameras or sensors, or it is collected by, browsers and other devices, and even created now. So data is by analyzing other information, and machine learning, artificial intelligence, all of that creates new information about people that people don't know about, don't understand, and don't understand the current or future use. And those are the issues that we're really concerned about. And in some cases, the companies at point of collection don't understand or contemplate the future uses of all of this information. So more and more of our lives, our personal lives, our professional lives, is being turned into data and then analyzed and monetized. And that includes when we're inside our home. It will include inside our vehicle. And when we think about inside our vehicle, for example, there will be 50, 60 or more sensors going to countless companies for various reasons that we may not understand. And so, again, I want to highlight that this data evolution, this is a great thing. There are awesome benefits. In fact, we need data-driven thinking to solve some of our biggest problems. But we do a terrible job when we look forward at evaluating risk, at contemplating problems, at preventing harm that results from that same collection. And then to bring it to our panel is that this is all still commercial sector, which is what I'm focusing on, which is where the innovation takes place and where this data collection is happening for a wide range of reasons. We know that much of this data, for a number of reasons and through various entities like data brokers, ultimately ends up with the United States government. And that could be the civilian government, such as agencies like HHS for COVID tracking. It could be law enforcement, and of course, it could be military or intelligence. And this is data that the government would never be able to get directly for constitutional or other legal restrictions, but through a data broker, they can get it. And it's not often transparent. And this has been in the media recently with news stories about location data in particular being sent from a mobile app to a data broker to the government. And the app didn't know and the users didn't know. And so that raises a wide number of issues for us for civil liberties and privacy. And then I want to make this point, which I know that my colleagues will jump on. This information, which is now collected and created in volumes we never contemplated, can go to the US government for good reasons and for positive research. We never discuss the fact that this also goes to foreign governments in various ways, even adversaries in various ways, the impact of the mosaic effect. And so that's not often part of the conversation, but I know my colleagues have views on that, that as we create this data and create this incredibly deep, detailed picture of not just American individuals, but our society, our communities, our culture, there are risks we never talk about that data moving overseas for other purposes. I've said a lot, I have more, but I'd love to hear from the colleagues.
So Greg, as the first federal CISO, can you address this question and particularly the impact to the federal government, as well as an industry leader?
Well, Mark hit, I think, 99 and 44, 100% of the major issues out there. And it doesn't matter if you're in the public sector or in the private sector. The collection and the commoditization of data. And by data, it's much more than just the textual type of data, the imagery, video, audio, all of this is being collected, it's being digitized, it's being packaged up, as Mark mentioned, commoditized, and it's freely traded on multiple markets around the world, not just domestically, but internationally as well. Everything that you can imagine is being digitized. And there's several things that come to play from the national security standpoint and, on the .gov side of things with the regulatory aspects, just standard administration of the day-to-day service to the citizens of the United States government. The federal government itself is a massive collector of information. It is also a massive consumer of information as well. And as the federal government, like anybody else, goes to these data brokers, that Mark referred to. And those could be pollsters, they could be standard data brokers, it could be third-party collectors from industry associations, whole host of different sources. We have really been deficient in identifying the privacy and the identity requirements of that information, because frankly, with artificial intelligence and some tools that are freely available off the shelf for many people, you can literally take that information, parse it, and be able to track it back to most sources in many cases. So that compromises the potential regulatory regime of identity and privacy. And it's high time, I think, we have a very open and transparent public conversation on this topic in the halls of Congress and with our policymakers. But as Mark so rightly pointed out, many of our policymakers are Luddites when it comes to technology. They don't necessarily know how all things are put together. And frankly, a lot of us technologists get overwhelmed by some of the new technologies that continue to be invented on the fly. So, but having that conversation is critically important now. I think we're a little bit late to need, but better late than never. And, you know, finally, before we turn it over to Joe, you know, I've talked to many of my friends who are in the legal community, and there's a great deal of discomfort for those who are actually working for companies who do, in fact, harvest this type of information, because they will turn to you and say, hey, Greg, you know, look at the user licensing agreement. This information, you know, you folks, if you want to use that browser, if you want to do this particular app, you have to acknowledge the user license agreement. User licensing agreements read like the phone book and are almost as thick as the phone book. Not that anybody has phone books anymore. But we are literally, by clicking through the user license agreements, we are signing away a significant portion of our lives, our identities, and our privacy to the companies that are out there. And we are, in fact, being bought and sold based upon who we are, what we do online, where we are, our locations, our browsing habits, who we talk to on the phone, when we talk, when we rise. Even if you have these smart watches or the smartphones, you're being tracked 24/7. Now's the time for that public and very open conversation about privacy and identity.
All right, thank you, Greg. OMB last year released some new policy addressing identity. The Committee for National Security Systems recently published some new guidance as well. So, Joe, if you can also address this question, and based on your recent experience retiring from Cyber Command, can you address it from a focus of military cyber operations?
Yeah, thanks, Art. I really want to start by saying that my thinking about this subject has evolved significantly just over the period since we've been talking about it to prepare for today's event. You know, I reflect back on the thoughts which led to my suggestion that we might use that quote from Lenin about the rope that might be used to hang us. And that was a reflection of a concern that in the current contemporaneous environment, we were, I thought, observing people exhibiting an increased willingness due to a demand to see their government do something about the COVID-19 situation we all found ourselves in, an increased willingness to accept an invasion of their individual privacy by the government. So that's where the initial concern came from. And you know, we've had long conversations about that, and I've commented on the fact that based on my own personal experience, it's not the government you need to be most worried about. It's other individuals you know you can't trust, like the neighbor you don't know is looking in your front window to see when you're not there so that they can steal stuff out of your house. It's potentially other sources of threat than the government that we'd be most concerned about. But in terms of the evolution of my thinking on this, I really think that our most recent conversations and your question pointed about whether one ought to consider Google to be the Ford Motor Company of the industrialization of this market for the sale of information about us. Initially, my concern there, which really started almost 15 years ago, was what's commonly said today. You know, if you're not paying for the service, then you have to recognize that what you're getting isn't a product, you're the product. And that the company that is providing you that thing you call a service is using your interaction with them through that service as a way to collect information about you. And then they sell it to other people who are willing to pay them for it, perhaps. And that, I felt at the time, was not a fair value exchange with me. I wasn't getting a fair trade on the value of the information I was freely giving up in order to be able to use this service. In that sense, you know, if that's the dynamic that's at stake, I think, yeah, maybe a company that's running a search engine might be a comparison to the big industrializer of the market, but I don't really think now, as my thoughts have continued to evolve, that that's really the dynamic at stake here. I think what's really at stake is what's being done with that information that's collected about us. And it really started, I think, with people who had a stake in profiting in commercial marketplaces from information about you. They, by knowing more about you, could produce targeted advertising that's more likely to be effective with you because it achieves some way of activating you in order to get you to make a buy decision about their product. And that dynamic is called influence operations, if you put it in military terms. And the weaponization of that technology is exactly what is used by the adversaries of the United States and of US Cybercom, my last military organization, in conducting information warfare against the United States. So I think what we have here is a dynamic which has started with a purely commercial marketplace producing technologies that can be weaponized and used for the purposes of influencing the people of the United States to do things other than just buy products, such as who are you going to vote for? And it's the fact that simple dynamics like getting people emotional about a subject will cause them to want to do something about it, be more polarized, and align with a side, and then actually take an action. So activating people who are otherwise potentially just observers to a political phenomenon that's going on is accomplishing an extreme shift towards greater political activism. And some of that is a good thing. You know, a peaceful exchange of ideas would be a good thing, but the extent to which it might produce a violent outcome is a really bad thing. And absent the appropriate forms of regulation, we really have an unregulated arms market here in those terms, Art.
All right, thank you, Joe. So Ms. Zuboff, she also references the China syndrome in her book. The Chinese government developed a comprehensive social credit system described by one China scholar as the core of China's internet agenda. In order to improve citizens' behaviors as in individuals and enterprises, they're to be scored on various aspects of their conduct, where they go, what they buy, who they know. The scores and data is searchable by fingerprints and other biometric characteristics. So my questions are two questions. Is existing scoring systems in the US, such as credit checks and background investigations, similar to China's scoring system? And do you envision artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies maturing to a point that could create the US syndrome? Greg, I'd like to start with you.
You know, I think we do have the technology where we could, in fact, go and do this. But fortunately, here in the United States, we don't have that totalitarian style of government like we were seeing in China. So I think the answer up front is no. I don't think that the scoring systems that are used by our credit checks or background investigations are quite in the same league as the China scoring system, which is done by their government, a state surveillance system. Rather, here in the United States, these different surveillance with credit checks, background investigation, and the like is still within the hands of companies and private organizations. Now, that's not giving them a free pass and saying all the collection is a good thing. But from a nefarious state surveillance system, I don't see that happening in the United States, nor do I see the American public tolerating that. If you're in the federal government and you're contemplating that, keep it to yourself, because you're going to see a bunch of folks looking like me and Joe Brendler showing up with torches on their, outside your office building. We in America, we don't tolerate that. Now that said, right now though, we're seeing as Joe mentioned in the previous question, people are starting to realize that this collection and aggregation of data and where it's being consumed is continuing to raise attention in our community and others, and it's raising alarm in many cases, because that information that is collected by the credit bureaus, those who are doing background investigations, those who are aggregating vast troves of information, that in fact can and is being weaponized against people by nation-state actors, cyber criminal groups, and others for nefarious reasons. And for that reason, we need to be very cautious.
Thanks, Craig. Joe, what are your thoughts on these questions?
Just to keep it simple here, Art, I think Greg nailed it.
Okay. Mark, how about from a privacy perspective?
Yeah, so we have touched on really a large number of issues throughout the questions, and so I want to just offer a little bit more of maybe some bigger perspective about privacy in particular. So in the United States, we do not have a general privacy law. Every other, actually, Western democracy does. We are the only one that does not right now, and I'm optimistic and hopeful that we will address that. But right now, what we have is what's called a sectoral approach to privacy, with specific laws that govern very specific segments. And so, for example, people are often familiar with HIPAA, which is a privacy law that only applies to health information, but importantly, health information when it's maintained by a doctor or hospital. That same health data, if it's maintained by Google, is not covered by that law because of the way our laws are structured. Now, you asked about, for example, credit information. And actually, in the United States, we have a very robust privacy law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is a very comprehensive law that offers individuals all kinds of rights about this data of access and correction and the ability to see it. And there are also obligations on companies that collect it and share it and use it for the purposes of what we call eligibility, like, do you get credit or not, under what terms, do you get a loan or not? This law governs that use. Other uses of information in the United States are not governed by a similar law. It's sectoral, it's complicated. And then the United States government, of course, there are laws that apply there. And then above that is the Constitution, which governs everything in terms of First Amendment, due process, civil rights, and what our government can do about vis-a-vis our citizens. So that's just a little background to put in perspective what that legal framework is, which then goes to your question about, like, say, credit information. Our credit scoring system is nothing like what's taking place in Beijing, because that system is regulated by the FCRA, and it is highly regulated, and there are thousands of enforcement actions a year over this data set. In contrast with what's taking place in China, which really is, from my perspective as a privacy and cyber data protection guy, it is my worst nightmares coming true around the aggressive exploitation of data about people. It's what I would hope to never see occur, where a government, right, a totalitarian government is collecting data on every individual and about every movement and every action. Every spend is digital in China now. So the government is monitoring where you go and who you go there with, so who you're associating with, your expenses, your expenditures, and your communications. And by analyzing that robust, almost unbelievable data set, can produce what they would call a government loyalty score, or your, how sympathetic or pro-communist party are you, and then tie government benefits or privileges to that score, or even worse, penalties. That is the nightmare scenario of data collection when it's run centrally by a government, as it is in China. We have similar capabilities here, right? So the technology exists for sure. Now here, particularly when it comes to like First Amendment protected issues, our government should not be doing that. We don't collect data on your religion, on your political speech, any of that. We do not do that absent some compelling circumstance. And we should not be creating databases like that. It's not how we're set up. I will say though, in my tenure in the White House and other offices, well-intentioned people have made proposals that I've reviewed that, sent me through the roof. Well-intentioned, but things that we do not do in the United States or should not do with data about our citizens. And that's why we need a law, we need a privacy office, we need individuals overseeing not just the security of data, which is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We need people looking at the use, right? When that data comes in, yes, there are lots of things we can do with it as a government. There are things that we can't do legally and shouldn't do as a democracy, and we need to look at that more closely in every venue, the intelligence community, civil government, so that we can walk that line. Because as the technology increases, as data collection, sensors, observation, artificial intelligence, the capabilities to do it increase and become easier, and therefore, for often positive reasons, people will want to move in that direction.
Art, I know you're
so.
going in a rotation here, but Mark's comment got me thinking and about the sufficiency of my previous answer that Greg nailed it. And it's not a counterpart to what Mark was saying. I want to first just address the aspect that you introduced in the question about AI and ML and that coming in the future. And I think that to some extent that's in fact already happened. When you look at simple technologies like CAPTCHA, being a mechanism through which you're applying some technology to determine whether it's actually a human that's interacting with the system, that's already in place. On the negative side, there are artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies being employed to produce what are referred to as deep fakes, which are intended to deceive. Another form of military operations, if you put it in the context of information warfare. And with that kind of set into the back, I think that another thing we can reflect on here is that this is difficult because there's a universal requirement for trust. And in order to derive the information that you need to make a decision about trust, you actually have to monitor the people to determine whether they continue to deserve trust. You just don't blanket give people access. You don't let them open your door when you're not home in most cases, unless you have a mechanism for making that trust judgment. So in modern terms, we're evolving with the assistance of a lot of really smart people, what's referred to as a zero trust architecture, which really is probably more accurately described as a continuous trust architecture, in which you actually observe the behaviors of the individuals on the network, the actions that they're taking, the characteristics of the equipment that they are employing, its configuration and so forth, and you're making a continuous assessment of whether they still should be connected. They should still be granted access to the information that they can get through that connection. So in that sense, there is a need to collect information so that we can determine whether we should still trust. But absent the appropriate regulations that can be turned by a purely commercial marketplace into something that could be weaponized and used against us. And we need the assistance of the government to provide the appropriate regulation for it.
So can I following up on that? It comes down to, I'm going to tie together actually two of Joe's comments. What this conversation is coming down to in many respects is use, right? So, right, I fully support and always have support the collection and use of data, robust data, for the purposes of cybersecurity and authentication and management. We must do that, right? We don't have privacy without robust cybersecurity. The problem is that in both the private sector and the government, is that that data is collected for the purpose of fraud detection or authentication, and then somebody decides there are 50 other uses for it. Well, we already have it, so why don't we do this and this and this? It wasn't disclosed, it wasn't the initial purpose, it was a secondary use. It may or may not even be lawful under the various laws it was collected. But that is, I think, the issue. One of the issues I think both Joe and Greg are raising, which is that this data collection has very important uses, and I've always supported that. The problem is these secondary uses, and I mean, Greg and I can think back to meetings we were both in the White House where there was a data set collected for a meeting, a purpose, a specific purpose, and we won't use offices or names, but someone had a clever secondary use that wasn't contemplated. And both of us challenged that and said, well, first of all, you want to take the data out of the network it's in, you want to move it. That use wasn't contemplated. The individuals who provided it didn't contemplate that use. So that's a challenge we face because there aren't laws that govern that enough. In the private sector, it doesn't. If it's in your privacy policy, very often that use is fine. But it's contextual and it's about what was expected, reasonable consumer expectations, reasonable citizen expectations, and following laws and ethics and being responsible data stewards. And we ran into these problems. When you collect the data for cybersecurity, the data should be used for cybersecurity and not 20 other potential uses. And that's a big tug of war because some of those uses might be beneficial, but we have to work that through. And the idea of like move fast, break things, we have to be done with that. And it's more think deliberately, contemplate risks and the benefits, and then move forward after you've done that thoughtful process.
Yeah, and I'll just pile on as maybe the last thought on this is, Mark's absolutely right. We sat in on meetings where there was a lot of ambiguity as we were addressing from a public policy standpoint how we were going to address certain issues regarding data. And Joe, you brought up a great exemplar with zero trust. I contend, as somebody who does do a lot of work with zero trust and participated in the ACT-IACT development of the zero trust study there, NIST with the 800-207 special publication, and working very closely with folks from Forrester, Gartner, and other organizations, Cloud Security Alliance. Zero trust is a security principle that is, as you mentioned, very context aware and conditional access. And to determine that, yeah, that really is Greg, and under these conditions, Greg should be given access to this information and nothing else. That's a treasure trove of information that could be repackaged and sent off to do something else. That's secondary use, or maybe even a tertiary use. And really, we just don't have any cogent laws on the books here in the United States regarding what do we do with that data, nor within our profession have we really clearly defined norms and rules of engagement for how that information is aggregated, primarily used to make those zero trust access determinations. But what do you do with it afterwards? Does it go into your SIM? Does it go into your log files forever? Or is it now a commodity that can be parsed and repackaged and developing value for your organization, even though the individual from which it was derived did not overtly give you permission for that particular purpose? That's really where I think that open and transparent conversation on privacy and identity really needs to be put forward so that we can address, not only from a legal aspect, but within the profession, what are those norms that we should follow?
All right, thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to share my thoughts about this question. So I agree with what all of you said. I'm not concerned, at least not right now, about the U.S. government becoming a U.S. syndrome like China, where they're collecting information and using it maybe for purposes that don't benefit the average citizen. But what I'm more concerned about is how private corporations are collecting information today that may hurt citizens. They may not be able to get a loan. Maybe they may be denied a job interview. They may even be denied health insurance. So that's where my concern is, not so much with the government right now, but where private sector is going, collecting all of this information and potentially impacting U.S. citizens. So let me move to the next question. This question is related to the title of the panel. The New York Times published an article, again written by Ms. Zuboff, entitled, "You Are Now Remotely Controlled. Surveillance Capitalists Control the Science and Scientists, the Secrets and the Truth." She states that our digital century was to be the democracy's golden age. Surveillance capitalists manipulate the economy, our society, and even our lives with impunity, endangering not just individual privacy, but democracy itself. So my question is, do you believe this is what, from Vladimir Lenin's quote, what he was referring to about capitalists will sell us the rope which will hang them? And could this technology be used today in the US as the rope? And Joe, I'd like to start with you, since you recommended this title for the panel and the article.
Yeah, thanks, Art. And I think your answer to the last question is kind of a great segue to this, because part of the concern that's embedded in it. I reflect on the fact that initially, what I was concerned about when I suggested that thought to you was our government as a consumer of the data and the potential that that might constitute a threat to the individual liberties, and that the dynamic that was occurring was that people's willingness to accept the collection of that was reinforcing that role for the government in the context of a commercial marketplace that was all kinds of lined up to sell them the products to do it with. And just thinking about what's really going on here, it occurred to me to question whether this might be that phenomenon that in my early days, we thought of them as the communist adversary, actually had in mind. And I reflect on the fact that there's two little quotes that kind of have really stuck with me for decades, one of which was this one, and the other was, "Our grandchildren will bury yours." And I'm thinking about the fact that, well, now those grandchildren are adults now, and we're in a time when our commercial industry is producing the product that might be used to actually change the nature of our government and make our government look more like the one that we were afraid of. So that was the original concern when we came up with the name for the subject. But I think, as we talked about before, the thought process, for me at least, has evolved since then, and it's really this concern about what would be done with the data, not necessarily by the government, but by other collectors and processors of that, to provide that information to additional parties who might want to use it to activate us or influence our behaviors. And that danger, I think, is a real manifest danger that we should be concerned about. And that's sort of the angle on this that takes a completely different view of how is the government involved in this question. It's not the government being involved as a consumer in this case. It's the government trying to find its appropriate role as a regulator in this case, I think.
All right, thank you, Joe. Greg, what are your thoughts?
Frankly, I tend to agree with many parts of what Ms. Zuboff talked about. With those folks that are part of that surveillance capitalist group, they feed up to a thirsty and willing constituency. It's kind of like what Leonard Skinner, what do you people want to hear? And we see folks, you go in and you type in, let's say you go to Google News and you say, okay, Google, tell me the news. And then they serve up the news to you. And a lot of that is shaped by what you've previously looked at, your browsing history, who you associate with, all these different attributes. And it almost becomes an echo chamber. And Facebook's the same way. You go into Facebook and you typically gravitate towards sources that amplify what you want to hear. We do that with television as well, radio stations, other media sources. And we've seen that these companies that have been gathering data and repackaging it, they're selling us on certain things. And since we're the product, they're selling us ourselves. And they're clustering us and giving us information that merely, I believe, reaffirms some of the things that we already believe, and it causes what many people are now calling echo chambers. But the good news is there's an easy countermeasure that's free and simple. It's go to other places for your information. Deliberately get outside your comfort zone and go out and look for the alternative views and make sure you do your homework. If you keep on watching one television station, you're going to be influenced only by that one source and what they decide to spoon feed you. So as I tell my parents, get off the easy, the lazy boy recliner there, change the channel, go watch something else, go read newspapers, and oh, by the way, online you can go read lots of different things. So I think we as a society, we need to do a better job and change the channel as often as possible so that we can get a better view of the world and a better view of ourselves. And certainly this has never been more magnified than what we saw during 2020 and the elections, with all of the misinformation and the disinformation that's out there. And I define disinformation as the willful construct of information that is designed to steer you towards a strategic or a tactical objective. Misinformation is the inadvertent spreading of that disinformation. It's kind of like running the manure truck out in the fields. You got the folks that are spreading the manure, but the folks that are in the production are the ones who are doing the disinformation. I think as we've seen during the election and the process leading up to it, there was a lot of disinformation being put out, and a lot of folks were passing the manure and all that misinformation just by hitting share, and weren't even verifying that information that's out there. And I think that's something that we all as citizens need to be very cautious about and very sensitive to.
All right, thanks. Mark, I'll get to you in a moment, but Joe, when you recommended the title for this panel and the article, it reminded me of the book and the movie Dr. Zhivago. And if you've ever seen the movie, I thought about how people lost their physical privacy where they were all forced to live together in a single home. So Mark, from a privacy perspective, this particular title, people start not trusting each other when they lose their personal privacy. But from an IT perspective, what are your thoughts about this question?
Okay, so a number of things. So first, I do want to introduce at least a glimmer of optimism, which is that I love technology and I love digital technology. And in fact, I spent years in the ad tech space. You would be stunned at how many connected devices are in my home, how many laptops and mobile devices I own. And I am personally on every social media platform. I'm, given my profession, surprisingly, a not very private guy personally in terms of what I put out there. And I eat it up. Like, I'm looking forward to the next upgrade of a device and software. And I see all the tremendous potential and I love it. What the concern is, and what, again, I'll repeat, what we have not done well, companies have not done it well and policymakers have not addressed it, is as we innovate, we have not done not even a good job of assessing risk, whether the risk is cybersecurity as we launch a new product or service with lots of bugs that are discovered weekly, or whether we're thinking about we've created a product, how will it be used or manipulated or leveraged by not just great commercial users, but others. We just don't do that, right? We see the bottom line. Let's face it, Silicon Valley operates for profit. If there are shareholders, the objective is to increase value. And if slowing down, if baking in more security, if limiting the use of data impacts that, well, the value of the shares is likely going to trump. And we need to get our hands around that. And I think that's, in some respects, what the argument about surveillance capitalism is, that the value of the company and shareholder value can't always trump privacy and security and cybersecurity. They need to be baked in, and being more thoughtful has to be done, specifically thinking about uses of information and new kinds of information. Think about the future smart city we might all be living in. How many sensors will be in that smart city and your automobile? What sensors will exist on every corner? And who gets access to the data from all the video cameras? The county, the state, the federal government, private companies? Well, they all can. And then for what uses? What uses will be off limits? We have not grappled with that, and we need to address that in a comprehensive way, both for the commercial sector and for the government. I also want to point out that, from my perspective, privacy and the issues around harmful data use by the commercial sector government, it's related but different from the issues around disinformation and misinformation. And so I know we've talked about them. They're both important. I actually work on both, but they are actually different issues that tee up really different, complicated solutions. Disinformation and misinformation in particular, at least in the United States, and in terms of whether or not the government will help regulate, we have a First Amendment challenge in our country, that we have decided that the government will not be the content moderator of the internet or anything, which presents very difficult issues for us going forward in thinking about those issues. But on the privacy side, before we even get to that, it's about what information can be collected, created, and then used. And we need to understand those uses, because companies themselves don't know. So I'll finally address the point that Greg was making, which was more about the disinformation. But I want to say that I want to caution that I don't think the solutions here are going to rest with individuals, because I don't think individuals will ever be able to understand the scope and the scale of data collection, data use and creation by all the devices and services we use. It's impossible. And so we need to make sure that we have obligations on companies like a Facebook or a Google or an Apple or an Amazon or Snapchat. The obligations belong there to be responsible stewards of data, to use data ethically, to be transparent, and to not cross that line. And when we don't have those laws yet, I like what Greg said, we don't even have ethical norms around this yet. I have a passion, as people know, about kids and data. And I really object to a lot of the ways that social media and platforms leverage, collect, use data about kids, because, as both Greg and Joe were making the point, is the data collection then is used to activate, to cause behaviors. It's difficult enough as a grown-up to navigate that, but when you have no frontal lobe and you're 15, that really bothers me. And so we need to get a grip on all of those issues, or we're going to find ourselves in a place we don't want to be.
Mark,
quickly,
Oh, good, Joe.
I would add that, one other thing to consider as part of the background here is that opting out is not really an option. You could say you have the option to not participate in this digital society, but it's not really a practical option for most people for any length of time. You can go off the grid for some temporary period and have a vacation, but your ability to stay connected with extended family and the people who are meaningful to you, your job, and just about everything these days is it's just looking at so much positive potential, as Mark mentioned, that you really don't have an option to not participate in it anymore.
Particularly, citizens cannot opt out of the United States government. And so that's why, from my perspective, the government has that higher obligation because, I agree with Joe, by the way, that you really don't opt out of digital life. It's not really optional today. But when it comes to your relationship with the government, you can't opt out. You must provide your data. And therefore, the government has a higher obligation. You can't opt out. And then, of course, we have police powers that the private sector doesn't have.
Before we conclude our panel here, so Mark, I'm glad you brought up risk. In the financial sector, they have chief risk officers, military commanders make risk decisions. I don't think we do a very good job as a nation and as a government when we talk about managing identities and privacy information. And so to kind of wrap things up, just if I can hear from each of you, just maybe a minute or two about the need for a national comprehensive strategy and policy dealing with this topic and how risk fits into this type of policy and strategy. Mark, we'll start with you and Joe and then Greg.
Great. Well, thank you. And again, I'm glad we're returning to risk because as Greg may recall, when I was the privacy advisor in the White House, I tried to make risk and accountability the central elements about privacy, moving away from this discussion about just give me a checklist. What are the 10 things I need to do? There is no checklist because this is so contextual and it depends on the circumstances and who's collecting the data and how it's used. What we need is a comprehensive, continuous approach to managing risk around data and information. Part of that risk is data security, which is confidentiality, integrity, availability. But a part of it, which we have not done, to your point, well at all, even if we've been doing it, is looking at the data use and then saying, well, here's our mission and here's how we intend to use the data. But by doing this, by collecting it and using it this way, what are other potential harms or adverse consequences or problems that may arise from the authorized or lawful data collection? So let's put aside data breaches. But if we do this, what are the negative downsides? When the government does this, is there going to be a chilling effect? Will citizens not want to engage? Will there be a loss of trust if we go down this path? What are the harms to individuals whose data we have? What are societal harms? All about trust. And so what should occur is, and whether we call it a privacy impact assessment or a data impact assessment, or it's part of a bigger risk assessment, is to look at the process of data throughout that whole life cycle. Right? Greg knows I'm really passionate about data governance because if you don't know what you have, and I would argue that most people, most agencies and companies don't, it's hard to know what you're doing with it. But get a sense of that and then look at the collection, use, the full life cycle, and look at risks that come from the data use. Again, not the risks about the data breach, okay, now the bad guy has it, but should we collect it up front? Will the use create issues for people? Will they stop engaging? And that's something that, and then, by the way, that's not the end of it, right? So you identify risks, and then you go through a process of saying, okay, let's assess the risks. Let's take steps to mitigate risk where possible. And it's not about no risk, right? No risk is no data. No one wants that. You mitigate risk to the extent possible, and then you actually take ownership for what I call residual risk. And you say, okay, there's some risk involved in this process around data and data use, but the benefits are this, and so I accept. I know the risk exists. If something goes wrong, I'm accountable, but it's worth it and makes sense. And then, of course, it's a process of ongoing, continuous monitoring of risk. That's what needs to happen. But sometimes we may identify risk, we may take steps to mitigate it, but very few people like to discuss that residual risk and then be accountable down the road. And so I will say NIST is working on this right now in a NIST privacy framework, which is designed to enhance and work with the NIST cybersecurity framework. But it's still in its infancy, and but it's a good effort.
Joe?
So I would add, in addition to what Mark has discussed here in risk management, that takes you from an initial judgment about what happens if we get it wrong to what can we do about making it less likely for it to happen. That there's really two characteristics associated with risk that we try to control. One is the probability that it will happen, and the other is the consequence that will occur should it happen. And both of those are variables that to some extent we can do something about, and they both factor into the things that we do in order to mitigate risk. Sometimes we mitigate the probability, sometimes we mitigate the consequence. And in a perfect world, we do both. And what Mark was saying about being accountable for those decisions and the residual level of risk that is accepted, somebody has to be accountable for that. On top of that, I take it back to what we were discussing before with trust. What we're talking about in many cases here in the context of today's panel is really whether the decisions that we're making with regard to identity and privacy and the outcomes that may occur should we get the decision wrong, that's what's producing the risk. And in that sense, trust and transparency go hand in hand. Transparency requires the exchange or collection of information. The risk of somebody else being able to exploit that same information for a nefarious purpose is also part of the risk. So it's more than just the initial decision that you may think is the subject producing the risk analysis. Over.
Greg?
Well, gentlemen, thanks so much for including me in this panel. To get to this question, and I'm sensitive to the fact that we only have a short period of time. Several years ago, I was a member of a diplomatic mission of the United States under a diplomatic role. And I was asked by a senior member of a foreign nation's government why the United States government was so chaotic and inefficient. And I told that senior government official that the reason that the United States government was not designed to be efficient was it was deliberately created to avoid tyranny. Our government was designed to be fair, not efficient, so that the tyranny, too much power being in the hands of a group or special interest, would not be the case based upon how our government was formed. And I think really right now when it comes to information, we are at an inflection point on how our data about us is consumed, it's how it's packaged, how it's managed, and things of that sort. And as I started out the conversation with my plea that I think we really need to, from a public policy standpoint, have a very open and transparent conversation on identity and privacy so that we do not find ourselves in a condition of tyranny when it comes to our identity, our privacy, and our data. And I hope that today's session sets the stage for all of the folks in the audience to participate in that very open and transparent discussion, because only we, the people, can resolve this. Back to you, Art.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like to thank Major General Brendler, Brigadier General Twohill, and Mr. Grohmann for a lively discussion, and this concludes our panel.